Hey folks! I went to England at the beginning of April and I went to a few museums as I am prone to do. And while I was in London, I went to the British Museum. Not for the first time, as I did visit back when I was a baby university student, embarking on my quest to become the disaster that is now appearing on your screen. I returned to the British Museum because I had a genuine curiosity about how things had changed, and also because I was curious about their brand new temporary exhibition, Legion: Life in the Roman Army. You wouldn't necessarily guess from the content of this channel, but I actually have a degree in classics. And at one point, I was very seriously considering doing a master's degree on a Roman topic. Around the same time that I first went to the British Museum, I also had the opportunity to be a volunteer excavator at a British Roman excavation along Hadrian's Wall. I became obsessed with the Roman frontier because the Roman frontier is really cool. I think I've said this before, but I absolutely love the overlap of culture. The middle of the Venn diagram where two cultures are interacting and borrowing from one another and creating these new belief systems and foods. And the Roman Empire was, of course, massive, and so they were interacting with all of these different cultures all over the place, creating all of these little subcultures, these little cultural microcosms all over the place, which I just find endlessly fascinating. Anyway, I almost did a master's degree on that overlap of religion on the Roman frontier, but then I remembered that I don't come from money and academia is for the rich, and so I decided to not go down that route, despite the fact that I really wanted to. Basically, this Roman army exhibition is very interesting to me, and I want to tell you what I thought about it as a once aspiring Roman historian, now turned museum person. But if you are in fact new here, please do consider subscribing, as I have two really interesting projects coming over the next 2 months, and they're both pretty big. They're going to be much longer than this video, and one of them I've been working on with a friend for nearly a year, and it's kind of sexy. If you like museums and niche historical topics, please do consider liking this video and subscribing. When I do these exhibit and museum reviews, I always try and take notes as soon as I am done walking through the institution. I want to make sure that I have notes that are as true to my visiting experience as possible. I usually do a rough draft of my first, script notes, and then I go looking for other people's opinions and things, other reviews online, and get kind of the general consensus on how well it did. Was it a swing and a miss, or is it the best thing since sliced bread? I try to see what sort of reviews I can find on both sides of the track, because generally my opinions fall somewhere in the middle. The general media reviews for Legion: Life in the Roman Army are overwhelmingly positive, but I do think that we see ancient Rome and can get caught up in the romance of it, myself included. I saw the Vindolanda tablets in this exhibition and I started frothing at the mouth a little bit. There is such a wealth of historical Roman information out there. There's documentaries, there's books. Everybody knows some fact about ancient Rome. It's everywhere. It's taught in schools, and it also has a very firm foothold in our popular media. But I found that the reality of the Legion exhibition at the British Museum was somewhere between the poetic, polished media reviews in The Guardian and the boots-on-the-ground experience of people venting their very valid struggles on the British Museum's TripAdvisor page. In my own personal opinion, I think that the exhibition had an interesting story and narrative and explored a lot of different aspects of Roman army life that I think most people from the general public wouldn't have considered before. However, the execution of this project, its accessibility, and some of the missed opportunities are something that I think are definitely worth dissecting and discussing, which is why I am now sitting here in front of you on the other side of this screen. The exhibition is laid out in such a way that, as visitors, we are following the exploits of a man by the name of Claudius Terentianus, a Roman citizen who is bent on becoming a Roman soldier. And Claudius Terentianus is a very interesting character because he was a real person. And I think that that is far more impactful than if they had just made up a character for the guest to follow along with. The exhibition follows Terentianus' journey as he climbs the ranks of the Roman army's hierarchy, through battle, life at forts, and finally to his retirement, all of which is accompanied by very interesting artifacts and insightful interpretation. There was also a rat. Accompanying the story of Claudius Terentianus is a cartoon rat whose name is Claudius Terratus, because of course, and he is from something called Horrible Histories, which, as a Canadian, I'm not familiar with. I think it's just something that is from the UK. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Terratus was supposed to be like the children's interpretation for becoming a Roman soldier, and I have a lot of feelings about the rat and also children's interpretation, but I'll come back to that in a bit. I overall liked the content of this exhibit. I liked the way it was presented, for the most part, but my visiting experience was somewhat negative because it was so goddamn busy. To view Legion, you had to pay an extra 22 Great British pounds to go in, and you were given a time slot. I paid extra to view this exhibit, and so I thought with that extra payment I would, have some elbow room, I would be able to read the interpretation at a reasonable pace and enjoy the artifacts that were on display before the next wave of people came in. I'd booked 2 hours in advance of my time slot because that was the soonest that they could get me in, which in retrospect should have been a red flag. But I went and grabbed a bite to eat and kind of just killed some time in the gift shop before I went to go and see this thing. The first area was so bottlenecked and crowded, I decided, you know what, I'll skip ahead a little bit, circle back if I feel like, enough time has passed, 10-15 minutes. But I went back and the crunch never stopped. So I ended up deciding to just elbow my way to the front to take pictures of the interpretation and view it later, I guess. Which, not my favorite way to experience a museum. You walked into the first part of this thing and you just kind of stopped because there was no clear, start here spot for the interpretation. Or maybe there was, but I couldn't see it past the giant wall of people that were in front of me. It was kind of a nightmare. I also didn't go on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday morning or something. I went on a Friday afternoon. I don't know why it was so busy. I was really hoping that I would get out of the crowds of the general British Museum area and this place would be much quieter, but no. Also, because it was so crowded, it was really hard to read some of the interpretation because it had big panels and small panels, and all of the small panels were in small font, they were down low, so if one person was reading it, nobody else could. I had a very similar issue a few months ago when I did a review of the Women Dressing Women exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which I also did a review about if you are curious. The insane crowds of people and the format of the interpretation speak to some pretty big accessibility issues that I think really need to be addressed, especially when it's being put on by such a large institution like the British Museum. It did get smoother as you progressed through the interpretation. However, that first little bit feels like a major design flaw. And I feel like, at bare minimum, you could have just let less people in per time slot. You will have to wait longer, but honestly, I personally am fine to wait a little longer if it means that I can actually see everything that I'm paying for. I was hoping that it was just my visiting experience that was like this, but after I had finished, putting my thoughts on paper and started looking for other reviews, I found the British Museum TripAdvisor page. I kind of stumbled down into the review section, and it features reviews ranging from 2 to 5 stars that all complain about the hordes of people and insane crowds, with emphasis on how the first area was the worst. But to go over some things that I liked about this exhibit, I will say I absolutely loved the idea of following an individual as he is pulled through his career in the Roman army. I think using Terentianos was a really good idea, not just because he was a real person who existed several thousand years ago, but also because he wrote letters, and those letters inform a lot of the narrative beats throughout this exhibition. I also really liked the items that were on display. I saw a few shoes and the infamous birthday invitation tablet from Vindolanda, a fort along Hadrian's Wall that is my favorite historic site on planet Earth. And I think it's nice to see the British Museum collaborating with these smaller institutions. Seeing the complete shield that was on display, which I was seeing photographs of everywhere, was also extremely cool to see in person. Despite the fact that we are following Terentianos throughout this entire exhibition, we still learn a lot about other people too. When you think of an army, you think of soldiers and weapons, but I personally find all of the non-soldiers way more interesting. You've got your sex workers, your cooks, your administrators, your children, your wives, all of the people who kind of tag along on campaign and are stationed on the frontier with the army. And I think Legion did a really good job at exploring them as well. My favorite parts were about the fort because of my earlier stated interest, as well possibly because these areas were less crowded, but I thought that they were really interesting and brought something very unique to the table, offering a perspective that I don't think many people consider when thinking about the Roman army. I've talked about some things now that I didn't like, I've talked about some things that I did like, but I think I've left my biggest gripe with this exhibition until now. We need to talk about children and human remains. We need to talk about the rat. So accompanying the quote adult side of the exhibition that we just discussed is our friend, the cartoon rat, Claudius Terratus. And he provided first-person interpretation that was very similar to the adult interpretation, but in a more simplified way. The human, Terentianos, became a soldier. Terratus became a soldier. Terentianos went on campaign. Terratus went on campaign. Terentianos engaged in battle and committed war crimes. Terratus was mysteriously absent from that part of the exhibition. Sometimes the children's interpretation was right next to the quote-unquote adult's interpretation, and sometimes it was on the completely other side of the room in like a kid's area, which is interesting. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that before, and I have some mixed feelings about it. Not very mixed, mostly negative. On one hand, I think it is important to give people something to do in a museum exhibition, and also to appeal to as many demographics as possible. I think having something for kids to latch onto is incredibly important, because that way they can engage with history at a younger age. However, I don't think it was executed as well as it could have been. Walking through this exhibition, there was very frequently a very dramatic shift in tones from the kind of real, hard adult history to the children's history. And as I was walking through Legion, on one side of the room, it felt like there were these very serious discussions that were happening, and then on the other, it felt like there was a playground. I haven't mentioned this yet, but at one point there were skeletal remains on display. I already have issues with human remains being on display, especially if they don't add anything particularly interesting to a narrative, and just generally 99% of the time, human remains should not be on display. I have an entire video about why, if you want to check that out after. But to have these remains on display and to have accompanying interpretation talking about the grisly murder of these two people who did not consent to be on display, and then you walk 3 steps and your old buddy Radis is there in all of his cartoon glory, and it was just a level of tonal whiplash I was not expecting. It feels like they were torn between having this very serious academic exhibition, but sponsorship money was trickling in and somebody really wanted horrible histories to be included, so they had to put the rat in. And honestly, I do wish, honestly, genuinely, that they had just leaned fully into the rat. Show Taratus committing war crimes, you cowards! Also, if memory serves, I remember it feeling like all of the interactive fun bits were geared towards children, which I don't think is entirely fair because adults can also gain from interacting with museum spaces, and also adults like to play too. I think a good museum exhibition has something for everybody to learn about in a very enmeshed way. But as far as the interactive bits went, it was really fun. They had a bag that weighed as much as like a Roman equipment bag that you could try and pick up. They had this other section with like a mirror and a shield, so you could pick up the shield and you could see yourself as a Roman soldier. And they also had these like tiles that you could flit, so you could learn about Roman flag standards. And there was some really interesting stuff, but it was all on the kids' side of the room, which made me sad. There was one interactive bit, though, that I hated. At one point, as you go through Legion, you are walking through a section called Battle. And there's lots of, Roman weapons and things on display, and they have this giant screen with some kind of foggy images of like a marching army, and there is a soundscape. And you can hear the sounds of the marching army and blades clashing and things like that. But I also heard this thumping noise. And as I left the battle section, the thumping noise was not getting quieter with the rest of the soundscape. In fact, it was getting louder. And I finally came to the section of Life at the Fort, and they had this table out that had different games, like different Roman games that you might play at a Roman fort. And there was this dome that contained a game of knuckle bones, which, I'm not going to go into how you play that, but basically you roll the knuckle bones to see if you win, and the way that they were emulating this was they were getting a platform to bounce, and you had to rotate a crank, a lever, in order to get this platform to bounce, and it made this thumping noise. The children were cranking on this thing like their lives depended on it. It echoed throughout the entire exhibition. I walked all the way to the front of the exhibition, the very first room, and you could hear it from there. It was so obnoxious. I had a friend who lives in the UK and was down in London to see this exhibition, and she said that apparently it was broken when she went, and I wish I could have been so lucky. Overall, it was a fine exhibition, although it did need some fine-tuning. So, some suggestions to the British Museum that are totally going to watch this. I definitely recommend having less people per time slot. I'm sure most people would be fine with waiting a little bit longer if it's a more overall enjoyable experience. Also, smash that Knuckle Bones game into 1,000 pieces. I'll do it for you if you want. Also, I've kind of already beaten this to death, but don't display human remains. It's not good. Just don't. Especially if it's not going to add anything meaningful to the narrative. I liked the content of this exhibition, but I do wish that more time had been spent on life at the Roman forts and things, but that's just what I like, and I wanted to see more of it. I do feel like it was a missed opportunity to not discuss the Ferial Duranum, which is a list of state-sanctioned religious holidays. Kind of reminds me of statutory holidays in Canada or bank holidays in the UK. I feel like they could have discussed that, and maybe they did, but it was so busy and I missed it. But if they did, good job. I also feel like they should have chosen to go fully academic or gone with Taratus. They should have done one or the other. I think splitting it down the middle was not effective. And again, that tonal whiplash, just going from one to the other, was confusing, to say the least. But that's just my opinion. Let me know if you agree or disagree. If you've been to this exhibition, please tell me what you think. I know there's a lot of kind of traction with it online right now, so definitely let me know, because I'm really curious as to what other people's experiences with this place are like. Thank you for making it to the end of the video, though, and hanging out with me. Please be sure to subscribe if you are still watching, because I have some really, really exciting projects coming up, and I'm really excited to share them with you. So make sure that you've got your notifications and things turned on for when those drop. But wherever you are, I hope that you have a wonderful day or evening and people are really nice to you and give you compliments. And I'll see you next time.